Hey everybody, it's just me here today. I've been working on a presentation for a while and I'd like to go through that with you today. So I'll share my screen and we'll get started. So a lot of people ask what the de jure society is and why we need a de jure society and also what we can offer. So that's what I've been working on, and I'm hoping that I can explain it to you in simple terms. So the purpose of this presentation then is to open your eyes to some of the many problems that we're currently experiencing in our nation, and perhaps offer some insight as to how we can move past these problems. There's a lot of work being done through social media to bring the truth to light and highlight some of the issues that we're facing within our political realm, but there's very little work that is being done on a solution. For any solution to be accepted, it has to be inclusive, and it has to take into consideration all of the people within our nation, no matter their stance on various issues. Solutions have to take into consideration our inalienable rights, and solutions have to come from the people rather than from an autocratic function. So let's get started. Grab a coffee maybe and join me for the next, I don't know, maybe an hour. So here's a number of terms that I'll refer to throughout the presentation. I put up the definition so that you can refer them after if you want a better understanding. What I've come to understand is, regardless of any ideology that forms economic policies, if there's corruption, that ideology will fail. So both capitalism and socialism can be corrupt. Many countries have a mix of socialism and capitalism, but if the rules are not well designed and efficient on either side of the scale, corruption always sets in. A totalitarian state on either side of the scale is equal to communism. And I have to say that in Canada, we are approaching that very far extreme right of the scale into a totalitarian state. We need a delicate balance of both systems in order for our nation to prosper. Industry has to be in harmony with the welfare of humanity. We currently have a society where industry rules the political realm with no regard to humanity. The two-party system in Canada perpetuates the endless divide between the left and the right. And the funny thing is, both sides are funded by the same oligarchs, I'll say, or political parasites. If it's those oligarchs that are running our government that I want to focus on in this presentation, because they're at the root of all ills within our society. The political labels are just that, labels. They have been fabricated by the various entities that wish to keep us divided, and each side of the label presents a different picture that you're to choose one side or the other. Let's drop those labels and heal the division. Let's focus on the system which lends itself to creating the division, and let's focus on the problems within our political realm that are leading us to a nation divided. For those problems are universal to us all. Those problems affect all the peoples within our nation, and I have no doubt that with a united front, there's nothing that we cannot achieve. So why do I say drop the political labels? Well, here's a good example. The corporate parasites support all sides of the political spectrum. Our politicians are mere puppets to the controlling corporations. To take one side or another provides cover for the shenanigans in the background. We're so busy worrying about the blackface that we fail to see what's happening in front of our eyes. I believe that's done on purpose. For if Canadians really understood what was going on, they would be pounding on the doors of Parliament demanding justice. So this is just one example. This is Mr. Gustra. It just shows there through the political donation site on Elections Canada that he contributes to both sides, conservative and liberal. I'm sure if the Green was a front runner, he would be contributing to them as well. Mr. Gustra is embroiled in the Clinton Foundation, the Uranium One scandal. He owns Gold Corp, which in 2010 was approached by a group of about 30 activists and representatives from Central American communities, where they protested because of the environmental and health concerns. And they said that Gold Corp has failed to address the people's fears that the mines are making them sick. So one thing that I've come to learn through my research is that if no matter how your corporation operates, good or bad, if you lobby the government, you're likely to get a boost or some sort of assistance. So one of the headlines here at the bottom is that the Canadian government supports Canadian mining companies in Guatemala. So all you have to do is lobby the government, and the government will go into another country and help you out to boost your business. So these corporations, they lobby the governments to advance their opportunities for profit, be damned of the human or the social cost. Here's another example, and this is the Desmarais, and again, you can see that they support both the Liberal and the Conservative Party. Paul Desmarais took over the leadership of Power Corp. It's a huge multinational management and holding company, and they have divestments in all kinds of financial services, asset management, sustainable and renewable energy, and other business sectors. There's an interesting quote here from the Globe and Mail, and it said that Desmarais has been personally consulted by the prime ministers on every major federal economic and constitutional initiative since the 1970s. And most of the time they have taken his advice. So who really runs our country, I'm sorry. Desmarais are shareholders in the French oil giant Total, and Total was the subject of a formal investigation by the United Nations in February of 2010 for bribery charges concerning oil deliveries from Iraq during Saddam Hussein's rule. Power Corp invests in shares in oil and gas projects, but they also invest shares in green ventures such as potential renewables or Nautilus solar energy. They fund Tides Canada, who is against oil and gas. The oil prices tank. Power Corp is able to gobble up more assets at a fraction of the cost, and that's how it works, my friends. There's a lot of notable Canadians associated with Power Corp. Paul Martin, former Prime Minister, worked there in the 60s. He bought Canadian Steamship Lines, which was a subsidiary of Power Corp. And according to the Paradise Papers, it's one of the offshore firm's largest clients implicated in that tax evasion scam. And I might point out that to this day, there has been no charges by the Canadian Revenue Agency or anybody that's been implicated in the Paradise Papers for tax evasion. Another one is Maurice Strong. He's the father of United Nations Climate Plan. He founded American Water Development, and they're embroiled in a lawsuit that alleges that they affect other communities' water rights and cause significant environmental damage. He's also the director of molten metal technology, and they have been charged with artificially inflating the price of their stock by material misrepresenting the capability of their technology. So not the best of people associated with Power Corp. Some other ones are John Chrétien, Bob Ray, Pierre Trudeau, Brian Mulroney, and Don Mazankowski. It's been said that Desmarais had a hand in installing every prime minister since the 60s. And that date is kind of important, and we'll get back to that later in the presentation. So what we have, we don't have a democracy at all. We have a corporatocracy. It's kind of a new term that's floating about. And basically what it refers to is an economic and political system controlled by corporations or controlled by corporate interests. That's definitely what we have. So what happens is a corporation assists a political candidate to secure the post that they want. And if they do succeed in securing that post, then they're obligated to the corporation. Then whenever the corporation wants legal and political help, the elected leader has to comply. It's been widely criticized since it can lead to economic exploitation, unfair lending practices, and dishonest use of the national treasury and resources. It's often used in relation to situations where CEOs are excessively paid, corporate taxes are planned differently from the rest of us, and free trade agreements are signed. So how do these corporations get established in our political system? Well, there's a number of ways, and let's take a look at that. The first one, the first way that they get established is through political lobbying. So it is legal in Canada. It's illegal for special interest groups to directly give a politician money or favors, but if they go through a lobbyist, it's perfectly legal within our country. So that's a process which individuals and groups articulate their interests to federal and provincial or municipal governments in order to influence public policy or government decision making. It's not only single lobbyists, it's also groups that lobby on behalf of their members. For example, CAP, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, filed 178 reports in the last year on different things from pipeline regulation, tax credits, Clean Air Act, etc. The Canadian Bankers Association, on behalf of their members, filed 131 reports on things like do not call list, identity theft laws. And the Mining Association filed 105 reports for their members on things like environmental assessment, skills training, corporate taxation, remediation, etc. So from the Lobbyist Canada website, in 2018 and 19, there was almost 7,000 lobbyists registered with the office. There was over 27,500 monthly communication reports filed. That's a lot of lobbying. You often wonder what our elected and appointed officials are doing with their time in Ottawa. Well, these numbers give you a pretty good idea of how they spend their time catering to the whims of the political parasites. How do you even monitor transparency when you have that number of lobbyist registrations filed each year? The top 5 subject matters that are listed in the communication reports are international trade, of course. They're looking out for their own interests. The environment, they maybe want some relaxation of the regulations. Health, industry, and economic development. And the government departments that are lobbied includes the House of Commons. It includes the Prime Minister's office. It includes Innovation and Science and Economic Development, Finance Canada, and the Senate. So you can see how bills like C-69 and C-48 get passed despite the hypocritical stance they take on the application of environmental concerns. If these bills were applied fairly across the country and across all industry, there would be some pretty unhappy corporations. So lobbying is one way they do it. Here's an example from Bombardier. And what you can see to me, it's on my left side, is that here's the number of registrations during the time frame that I was looking at, 120. 5 are currently active. In the middle, you can see that sometimes the corporation uses a lobbyist company, and sometimes it's one of the board of directors that's doing the lobbying, representing the firm. A snippet of the topics discussed is here also, and it includes financial assistance and tax loopholes or tax exclusions. So what we see in the headlines is that through this lobbying process, Bombardier gets awarded $428 million for the GO Transit rail cars, or excuse me, Bombardier gets $3.7 billion in various forms of government assistance, including interest-free loans. Sorry. And then another headline, it says, Bombardier is under fire over executive bonuses amid mass layoffs and government bailouts. So what happened is the same year that they got a huge bailout package from our tax money, the company's board of directors, among them is Pierre Bedouin, Laurent Bedouin, his father, André Bombardier, Laurent's brother-in-law, Jean-Louis Fontaine, another brother-in-law, and Joanne Bissonnette, his niece. So they like to keep it all in the family. But in that same year that the company received taxpayer money from our government, they were slammed for their sense of entitlement after awarding a huge $32.6 million to the senior executives. That's the same year that Bombardier handed out pink slips as part of an effort to cut 7,000 workers. So my personal feeling is that if a private corporation can't make a go of their company, then they deserve to fail, not to keep seeking taxpayer-funded bailouts. But that's how they do it. Another way that they get under the skin of our politicians is through lobbying. And it's a huge business in Canada. Another way that you might not be so familiar with is asset recycling. And that's where the government, in order to fund necessary infrastructure investments through proceeds made from the sale or lease of public assets. So they sell public assets to the private sector. One that you're most aware of is probably in Ontario when their government privatized Hydro One. That's, I guess, one of the biggest asset recycling projects that we can all identify. And you know what happened to the user fees to all those people that use the service of Ontario Hydro. It made the news for months and months, the extreme rise in everyone's bills. They're also looking to privatize Canada's airports. A lot of the airports are already privatized, but they're looking to privatize the rest. As an example, 3 Canadian pension funds, Alberta-based AIMCO, Ontario-based OMERS, and the Ontario Teachers Plan, earlier this year bought the London City Airport jointly with the infrastructure investing arm of the Kuwait Investment Authority. So this program, of course, is highly promoted by the corporate parasites such as Case or McKinsey and Company, both Bilderberg participants. It's sponsored by the World Economic Forum, of course, with ties to the UN and the One World Order. Case President Michael Sabia has said, for governments all around the world, this could substantially change how major infrastructure projects get financed by providing a solution to their fiscal constraints. Asset recycling is just another scheme driven by bankers and governments desperate to hide past failures of neoliberal privatization policy. Of course, this idea was generated through the World Economic Forum, a Bilderberg UN-connected organization. Here's another project or way that companies can get into, buy into Canadian infrastructure through government deals. This program, public-private partnerships, has been disbanded. I believe it was in 2017, but while they were in operation, there was over 100 infrastructure projects that have been put in place. And that's when the government and the private sector go together for delivery of the private goods, or for the delivery of goods and service to the public. You can see that any promotions by the P3 project, private-public partnerships, is sponsored by, of course, SNC-Lavalin. So some of the industry concerns regarding the P3R is that Canadian firms lose competitiveness to the large international firms. It results in Canadian companies having to downsize and outsource to deliver the volume of project requirements. This downsizing by Canadian companies leaves the door open for foreign companies to take over. P3 generates revenue through increased user fees and structured government payments over multiple years. So not only do we provide assistance to these corporations that take over these projects through increased user fees, but a lot of times there's government structured payment plans for multiple year contracts, which is of course taxpayer funded. Here's another, since the P3 was disbanded, of course, the newest dark adventure is the infrastructure bank. And that replaces the P3 program. And of course, everybody in our government is widely acknowledging that this is a great idea. Philippe Champagne stated that the P3 model is an important building block in the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. It allows private sector partners to be brought in earlier. The Infrastructure Bank is a new tool to finance infrastructure in the country, and it's designed to expand the opportunities from the public sector to attract the private sector investment from within Canada and globally. And it's important to recognize and globally, because a lot of the contracts are being awarded to international foreign corporations. So projects that are considered as transit, hospitals, bridges, all-season roads in the north. And the creation of an infrastructure bank will solicit funds from private investors, but don't let that fool you that they always get their money back. The government has donated 15 billion of our taxpayer money in seed money to help spur on private-public investments. One of the headlines when I was doing research, it says that the Federal Infrastructure Bank takes a glass half full approach to privatizing municipal water systems. And I hope that doesn't come to fruition, but it looks like with the passing of the USMCA agreement, we may have some issues with water and ultimately having to pay for our water, which is one of our own resources. So there's a guy, his name is Adam Smith. He's a member, or I don't know if he's still a member. He was a member of the Comer Group. That's a committee on monetary and economic reform. And he wrote a letter to Trudeau and his counterparts in regarding the infrastructure bank. And this is what he said. The government has allowed a council heavily tilted in favor of big business interests, representatives from BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, and McKinsey and Company to devise the plans for infrastructure bank that will facilitate the high returns on their investments. Despite the clear conflict, no disclosures were made and no one recused themselves from any of the council decisions. The government worked for months with these advisors to prepare for the closed-door meeting organized by BlackRock between Trudeau and institutional investors. BlackRock even tailored and vetted the infrastructure minister's presentation to ensure that's what investors wanted to hear. Furthering the conflict of interest is Michael Sabia, the president of CASE, who wants $1.3 billion from Ottawa for light rail. He's leading policy discussions on the infrastructure bank as a member of Minister Morneau's Advisory Council on Economic Growth. How are Canadians to have faith in a bank structured by the very players that will profit from it? That's a really good question. Another report that I read, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, they published a report, and it shows that as proposed, the Canadian Infrastructure Bank could double the cost of infrastructure projects. So yeah, not something that's good. Like I said above, it's another dark initiative. I just want to show you kind of how all these corporate parasites are connected. So on this page, we take a look at some of the board of directors from the Infrastructure Bank, and the connections between industry and the board of directors are very apparent if you take the time to look. So on the top left, we have Janice Fukakusa. She's the VP for RBC Royal Bank, the president of McCain Foods. Remember the listeriosis crisis in 2008 when 23 people died? Margie McCain was also, she's a lieutenant governor for New Brunswick, is also on that board of McCain Foods. Poonam Puri, she's with the Trudeau Foundation Fellowship. She's also a member of the International Association of Law Schools, which receives funding from the Open Society Foundation, also known as George Soros. Patricia Yauzwa, she's the CEO of Sask Power, which gave SNC-Lavalin millions in contracts. Sask Power overpaid SNC $111 million. Michelle Colpran, she's the VP for CDP Capital, which is a subsidiary of Caisse de Depot, who helped structure the Infrastructure Bank. James Cherry, he's a board foundation of Greater Montreal. That's a direct partnership with SNC-Lavalin. Jane Bird, she's an SNC-Lavalin engineer. Stephen Smith is on the board of SNC-Lavalin. He's also on the board of Metrolinx, which awarded the contract to SNC-Lavalin. So you can see that these corporate ties kind of run all in the family. These people with ties to SNC-Lavalin, Caisse de Depot, etc., RBC, are the ones that are on the board of directors for our infrastructure bank. Sometimes you just have to shake your head. So really we can all sum it up in this paragraph. I'm just going to take a drink of tea before I do that. This is my favorite author or journalist, whatever you want to call him. His name is Andrew Gavin Marshall with the Media Co-op, and he wrote an article on political parasites, and this is just an excerpt from it. Canada's elite own the banks and the financial institutions. They own our central bank, which sets the interest rate, gives loans and collects on debt, pushes people deeper into servitude and slavery, poverty as punishment. They control our media, which shapes our views and opinions. They sit on the boards of our universities, putting future generations into debt before they have a chance at life. And they control the knowledge economy for which they have defined the purpose of education. They influence and control our governments and political leaders. They sit on the boards of the think tanks that write policy and promote political agendas. They run the foundations and claim themselves to be benevolent philanthropists, when philanthropy at its best is moral masturbation for the wealthy, a way to feel good about their vast disparity of wealth, and at its more organized levels is simply a means through which to engage in social engineering and social control, to give a little in order to continue taking so much. They profit off the foreign wars our country wages and supports. They are blood plunderers of the Congo, Afghanistan, and Libya. The Canadian elite rule the country as a proxy for the American empire, acting as a resource suction cup for the behemoth below us, providing the United States with most of its oil, water, electricity, and timber. These rapacious parasites claim that they hold to the answers to the crisis they cause and profit from. And that certainly sums up the first few pages of my presentation. Indeed, they can be called corporate parasites. And parasites are an organism that lives in or on another and takes its nourishment from that other organism. These corporations control our government to bleed the resources from our nation and the money from our pockets. A book that I was reading just recently by Michael Hudson, it's called Killing the Host, and he had some good descriptions of political parasites in there. He said, at least in nature, smart parasites can perform helpful functions such as helping their host find food. But as the host weakens, the parasite lays eggs, which hatches and devours the host, killing it. That is what predatory finance is doing to today's economies. It's stripping assets, not permitting growth, or even letting the economy replenish itself. He gave a good example in regards to Jamaica. And what he said is that the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, announced a $1 billion loan to help Jamaica meet its huge debt payments due in coming years. As usual, the loan is to be accompanied by 4 years of austerity. So the IMF, by awarding this loan, is now able to dictate to that country what type of austerity cuts they must take. And it could be a pay freeze, it could be whatever it could be. The details are still pending. Also in that book, it was saying that embracing neoliberal policies is the only solution, much to the delight of the IMF, because they can come in and print their money, help out this country, and dictate then how that country is to be run. The IMF helps you out, but they define the terms of repayment. In essence, they control your government. I need to remind you that the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is an unelected body of elites who control the private banking sector. So I think that's a pretty good picture of what's happening with our government. The basics are understood. We now know that there's a corporate oligarchy, corporate parasites that control our government through various processes, such as campaign funding, corporate lobbying, asset recycling, private partnerships, and government initiatives such as the infrastructure bank. So behind closed doors, these political parasites, they collude to control the political, financial, social, and environmental elements of our lives. And as this truther says, George Carlin, one of the best truthers before truthing was fashionable, it's one big club and you ain't in it. The only thing standing in the way of creating a better and more equitable society is the collusions of these psychopathic, wealthy elite. They hold all the power and dictate the policies, and they have molded and shaped various institutions, especially those such as secondary education, finance, and economics, to their twisted ideology. I hope I've been able to show that that Canada isn't run by elected officials who are supposed to represent our views in Parliament, but rather it's run by corporate oligarchs who fund their campaigns and lobby their offices for favors. Just a few other things I want to point out that's kind of important to the rest of this presentation. One is that Canada is a corporation. So now that you see how corporate parasites work, how do you feel about Canada being a corporation? So yes, it's registered with the US Securities and Exchange Commission. The Queen has executive power, and she's delegated that executive power to the Governor General. So whenever you hear the word executive, that's a corporation term. Corporation is a legal entity that's separate and distinct from its owners. Corporations enjoy most of the rights and responsibilities that individuals possess. An important element of a corporation is limited liability, which means that the shareholders can take part in the profits through dividends and stock appreciation, but they're not personally liable for the company's debts or actions. You can find a statement within any of our major pieces of legislation whereby the elected officials operating under that legislation are granted immunity from prosecution. And the sad part is that the judges and the court system agree with that immunity, as we've seen in the little child case in Alberta. The judge in that case said explicitly, "I know of no legal duty on an elected representative at any level of government to consult with the constituents or determine their view. While it's considered desirable to do so, there is no legal obligation." This is governance without representation. This is not democracy. They are all sworn to the corporation. Every single politician takes an oath to the Crown Corporation. The entire purpose of a corporation is to make money for the shareholders rather than to pander to the constituents who put them in the office in the first place. And this is just backed up a little bit through some Supreme Court cases that Canada isn't a geographical unit, as we know, not a country, but rather it's a juristic federal unit. And that was outlined in a Supreme Court case in 1980. It says the word Canada in section 91, he's referring to the Constitution, does not refer to Canada as a geographical unit, but rather refers to the juristic federal unit. So that indicates that Canada is an artificial entity or a corporate body. A juristic person, it says, if you look in Black's Law, it says, see artificial person, and an artificial person is an entity such as a corporation. So while this information is really important to understand where we fit in Canada as a corporation, it's a subject for a whole another presentation. So I'm not going to dwell too much on this. Suffice to say that we've all been incorporated into the Canadian corporation through various contracts, knowingly or unknowingly, that we have signed, such as the birth certificate, the social insurance number, or the driver's license, for example. Once an individual has entered into these contracts, they're agreeing to allow the corporation to define the law and impose restrictions on your freedoms. So the basics are understood. Canada is a corporation. All of the municipalities within Canada are incorporated, no matter what city, no matter what town. All of them have been incorporated, and you as a resident of that community are incorporated into your community corporation. The other thing I want to point out here is that Crown land, also known as royal domain, is a territorial area belonging to the monarch who personifies the crown, the corporation. Canada, in fact, the corporation owns no land. The power to enact legislation comes, or the power to pass laws comes with ownership or title to the land. In order for the legislators to obtain jurisdiction over you, because they don't own any land, they must contract with you. Thus, the control is obtained through various documents, including your social insurance number, your birth certificate, your marriage license, your driver's license, or any other document generated by the state that you ask for. As employees of the corporation, we're subjected to those regulations or laws that they decide to levy out. So in order for it to appear that Canada, the corporation, owns the land, they've developed the Indian Act. And treaties giving the Crown the land in trust. It is a trust. The Crown is the trustee, the natives are the beneficiaries, and the land is the asset. The Indian Act is just a tool used to segregate natives and hold them subservient to the Crown while the Crown holds the land in trust. And in fact, we are all natives. We're all who are born on this land are natives. There should be no reason to segregate a particular group in our society. There's no such thing as native blood as defined in the Indian Act. It says, what is an Indian? It's someone with Indian blood. Well, I can tell you that one of my Indigenous friends has taken a blood test, and the results of that blood test, he has the same blood type as me. So what the hell is Indian blood? Anyways, another facade by the Canadian government. So let's take a look at the Constitution Act 1867 to 1982. There remains to this day many questions surrounding the validity of the Constitution Act. One thing I want to point out is that in a democratic society, a constitution is not like wearing a suit, which can be changed at the whim of the reigning fashion of the day. But that's exactly what's been happening. So no matter which government's been in control, they've made amendments to the Constitution Act, whether that's been through a legal process or hidden under the table, and some of that I'll be talking about. So a constitution is a set of rules. It governs the players on how a legitimate government is to exercise the power granted to them by the people. The Constitution was never ratified by the people. It was drafted and negotiated by politicians and took the form of a British Act of Parliament. Through the Imperial Conference in 1926 and the passing of the Statute of Westminster in 1932, Canada was granted to be an autonomous community, and Great Britain was ready to surrender legal custody of Canada's constitution. But patriation never occurred until 1982. So each time there was to be an amendment of the Constitution, the Canadian government had to summons the Parliament of Great Britain to grant the amendment change. In 1982, the Constitution was patriated to Canada to allow Parliament to make their own necessary changes without British Parliament involvement. But that 1982 Constitution was never signed by Quebec. Thus, it was never formally enacted. Failure to agree on an amendment formula was evidence that Canada could not constitute themselves a sovereign nation. The inability to ratify a constitution has left our country divided, and it leaves politicians looking to earn favor to play upon that division. The longer our country goes without a federal union, the more divided we become. The whole idea of ratifying a constitution is no longer even mentioned in political campaigns. They just allow the charade to continue. We're now left with a shared space within our nation, and that still needs governing, but it needs governing based on mutual respect and mutual understanding. So look at a couple of sections of the Constitution Act. Section 52, it's kind of important because it says that the Constitution is the supreme law of Canada, and that anything contrary to this law has no force or effect. So it's interesting when you apply some of the recent bills that have been passed and you look at the constitutionality of those bills. The Interpretation Act, on the other hand, says that both common law and civil law are equally recognized sources of law in Canada. So common law is the most unifying and equalizing force we could ever have. If you apply common law equally and fairly, it makes the richest person drive at the same speed limit as the poorest person. So what I just wanted to say is that there are two types of law that are legal in Canada. The Constitution Act is the supreme law of Canada, and the Interpretation Act also recognizes that common law and is equal of authority in Canada. Section 32 of the Charter, what this is saying is that this section, or this Constitution, applies to the government. It's really the government's duty. Anybody who works for Parliament or the government in any capacity, it is their duty to follow this Constitution and to ensure that the Charter is upheld and applied. And in Section 2, it says everyone has the following fundamental rights and freedoms: freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, freedom of the press, media, communication, and freedom of peaceful assembly. Peaceful assembly. And freedom of association. So the Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out, but it's important there that it's subject only to such reasonable limits as prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So then the question then becomes, whose laws are demonstrably justified? Is it civil law? Is it common law? According to the Interpretations Act, both are equal in their application. So I've showed you some of the problems. We talked about political parasites, how they're controlling our government. We talked about some of the history and the mess that's been created by the charade of the Constitution not being enacted. And how do we get out of this mess? Well, we do it by creating a de jure or de jure. I use those terms de jure in French and de jure in English. We create a de jure government governed by the people and for the people. It's that easy. What is de jure and what is de facto? The government we currently have in place is de facto. It means in fact, indeed, actually. It's a state of affairs which must be accepted for all practical purposes, but it is illegal or illegitimate. Exactly what we have. And a de jure government means rightful, legitimate, just, or constitutional. Thus, an officer, king, or government de facto is one who is in actual possession of the office, but by usurpation or without lawful title. While an officer, king, or governor de jure is one who has just claim and rightful title to the office, but has never had plenary possession of it, or is not in actual possession. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to create a de jure government and move forward from there. So how do we know that our government is de facto? Well, there are so many examples, but I'll give you a few. We already know that Canada is a corporation and not a geographical unit. We know that the corporation owns no land. The Parliament buildings that are sitting on rented land and any other lands that the Crown claims to possess are held in trust. So he who owns the land makes the laws, but they don't own any land. We know that the Indian Act is a trust and the trust has been broken. Sovereignty and ownership of the land go hand in hand. The Crown is holding the land in trust. Dissolve the trust, and the ownership falls back into the people of the land. This is why we've all become incorporated through various processes into the Corporation of Canada. They don't have ownership of the land, therefore they can't make laws to rule over us. But if we submit through their contracts, through deception, and or maybe through our ignorance of the situation, then they have the right to rule over us. Another example is, as humans, we have unalienable freedoms bestowed upon us by our Creator. Those unalienable freedoms are enshrined in a document known as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which was opened for signature by the UN General Assembly in 1966. And in 1976, Canada became party to this process. And finally, we're being governed on the basis of non-ratified government document, the Constitution. So there's many more examples, but you get the idea. So what is a de jure society? Simply, we're using the freedom of association to develop an alternative system of governance, which gives the people of Canada an alternative path forward. It's a system of governance that respects the Constitution and allows for the people to have a voice in constitutional matters that affect their ability to thrive and succeed in life. It's a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. We haven't yet developed what this government looks like. There's a rule book, which is the Constitution, but there isn't a playbook yet. There's no step-by-step plan on how this should be accomplished because it's never been done before. So a de jure society, it's not unlawful or illegal. It's not a revolution or an attempt to overthrow the present government. And it's not violent or disrespectful. We need to overcome oppression and violence without resorting to oppression and violence. It simply gives the people an option to exercise their free will to join a de jure society and help build a legitimate government, or to stay with the de facto government and participate in the demise of our country. There is no justice in a de facto government, and I just want to point out one case, but every day being a part of this group, you hear of another person who's looking for some solution, looking for some advice for a situation where they're not getting any justice within our court systems. So this one is in regards to Angèle Prince. She's a member of our group. She's Métis, and her family lived on their native land, and they produced artisan products from the maple supply that their land provided. They wanted to sell their homemade products independent from the Maple Syrup Federation. This led to a 15-year fight for freedom of association, which was denied by all courts. They went from civil court to appeal court. There was at least 30 to 35 judgments, all with the same conclusion: doomed to failure, no chance to success. So really, do we have the right of freedom of association in our country? It depends on what you're doing, I would say. It was through this lengthy court process that they discovered that the Quebec Federation of Maple Syrup Producers was in a conflict of interest. In 1990, the Quebec National Assembly granted the Federation the regulatory power, the power to enforce the Marketing Act, and Chapter M35, the power to prosecute. So this body cannot have the obligation to defend its members and the power to prosecute them at the same time. And the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General knew and didn't do anything to correct this obvious lie. Angèle, on threat of having her land seized, forwarded her concerns first to the ministers and members of parliament, and she received no response. Then she forwarded her concerns to the Queen, and here's a letter of responses back from the Queen. The Queen said to, what did she say? She said, the Queen says here, this is not a matter in which the Queen would intervene. As a constitutional sovereign, Her Majesty acts through personal representative, the Governor General, on the advice of the Canadian ministers, and therefore it's up to them it's to them that your appeal should be directed. So Angèle's telling them that she's getting no justice within the Canadian system with the Canadian Parliament, and she's seeking advice, and the Queen's sending her back to the de facto government that's giving her no justice. So really there is no hope for justice when you're going up against a de facto government or the corporate parasites. They help to administer the policy and the legislation. There's so many stories, like I said, that are brought to us daily of people looking for justice, and there is no justice within this system. We need to return to common law. So how did we get started? In 2015, there was a people's grand jury. It was initiated by a fellow named Denis Paiement after he experienced a workplace accident. He lost both of his legs above the knee, and from 2003 to 2015, he was treated very poorly by the CSST, which is a corporation equivalent to the Workers' Compensation Board, but this is a Quebec organization. So prior to the grand jury, Denis' case was presented before a notary public for arbitration. The CSST was summoned and appeared before the notary public. In this meeting, Denis' case was presented in a Quebec City courthouse with the CSST lawyer present. The notary public reviewed the case and presented a judgment in favor of Denis. They found that the CSST was guilty of 23 counts of failing to follow their own legislation. That's when it's determined that the grand jury had a case and they would proceed with a grand jury, a people's grand jury, and additional cases were added. In total, there were 7 cases. It took the people's grand jury 6 weeks to go through their process. And in the end, the jurors agreed that criminal charges should be laid. The grand jury judgment then went to the Supreme Court and received a default stamp or a default judgment. The file number is 31704 for those who doubt the validity. Everything that has been prepared and completed by this grand jury group has been duly notarized through the courts and delivered to the stakeholders. A return to common law is the only way we can return to a just society where the misdeeds of criminals do not go without consequences and where innocent individuals cannot be embroiled in false accusations. Excuse me, I'll just take a drink. Common law is the only way to grant the citizens of the nation trust in our courts and in the process that ensures fundamental freedoms are adhered to and maintained to with confidence. It was the only way through the grand jury process that total corruption by the state and other organizations came to light. The grand jury was granted a default judgment, which is a binding judgment in favor of the plaintiff. This exercise proved that common law is a valid process in front of the courts. And like we saw, the legislation that we have says that common law is equal in value and a valid form of law within Canada. Some of the things they learned from the grand jury, according to the People's Grand Jury, in 1968 in Quebec, the Quebec Bar orchestrated a coup and violated the BNA Act, or the Constitution Act of 1867. They abolished the Legislative Council that served as a protection against corruption and the abuse of power by politicians who are supposed to promote the interests of the people, not their own interests. It's stated in black and white in the Supreme Court case, Attorney General of Nova Scotia versus the Attorney General of Canada, 1951. It says that the Constitution of Canada does not belong to Parliament or legislatures. It belongs to the country. It is in that the citizens of this country will find the protection of the rights to which they can claim. The fact that Parliament can only legislate on subjects assigned to it by Section 91 and provinces can only legislate exclusively on matters assigned to Section 92 is part of that protection. Another Supreme Court judgment from 1981, it says the requirement of provincial consent for constitutional amendments did not emerge as early as other principles, but it has gained increasing recognition and acceptance since 1907, and particularly since 1930. This is clearly demonstrated by the proceedings of the Dominion Provincial Conference of 1931. So the dissolution of the Quebec Legislative Council and the creation of the National Assembly Act in Quebec would have expelled Quebec from the Canadian Federation by removing all sections of the BNA Act, including Section 5, 9, 51, Part 1, 71, 80, 90, 91, Part 3, 29. So how did Quebec receive the permission to alter our constitution so drastically without agreement from all the rest of the provinces? They didn't. Another thing, here's some more learnings from the grand jury. So the grand jury provides factual evidence that the leaders have not been forthright about the state of our constitution, about the supreme law of Canada, about the corruption of Canada, or about the injustice in our justice system. A grand jury can be described as the shield and the sword of the people, a shield for the people from abusive indictments of the government, and a sword for the people to cut away any crime by a private individual or public servant. And you can see there's the default judgment and the file number for the Supreme Court case 37104. So in a radio interview, lawyer Michel Lebrun, he was a witness in the grand jury. He himself stated that Quebec courts are illegal. They were called because they believe that the judge, who is a judge of the Court of Quebec, is not constitutionally justified. The Quebec Parliament is not the legislature. Only the Quebec legislature can create courts and thus make laws in the province. It's based on the fact that Quebec abolished its legislative council in 1968, going against the Constitution, which provides for a Quebec legislature with 2 chambers. Quebec has gone from a bicameral legislation, 2 chambers, to a unicameral legislation. And indeed, in 1968, the government of Jean-Jacques Bertrand passed the Legislative Council Act, which abolished the Legislative Council and gave the Legislative Assembly the new name of the National Assembly of Quebec. On December 12, 1968, the Legislative Council itself passed Bill 90 without a registered vote or a roll call. The abolition or the dissolution of the Legislative Council took effect on the 31st of December, 1968. That's the same year that Power Corp, the Desmarais took over Power Corp. The Legislative Council of Quebec was the upper house of the Quebec Parliament, and it existed from 1867 to 1968 and was never replaced. Although Canada abolished the grand jury in 1984, it was illegal, unlawful, and unconstitutional to do so. The first line in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms identifies that Canada is founded on the principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. Our Creator granted us freedoms which are recognized in the international covenants, and Canada signed on to them and reiterated in the Constitution. Common law is recognized in the Interpretation Act as an equally valid form of law. So then we get next to the Royal Public Society of of Canada. And basically it evolved after the 2015 grand jury. So the final judgment, which was communicated in the public domain to all of the major stakeholders that were identified in that judgment, it's been largely ignored, even after having receiving the default judgment from the Supreme Court of Canada. The grievances are many and the charges are serious. The involved parties who, by their own actions, inactions, omissions, or ignorance, have plotted over many years to defraud the Canadian people of a legitimate constitutional monarchy and constitutional governance. After the 6-week trial, grand jury trial concluded, and all of the corruption had been revealed, the members of the People's Grand Jury in 2015 gave a mandate to the Public People's Prosecutor to fix this mess. Thus, the Royal Public Society of Canada was formed as a foundation to build on. So the Royal Public Society of Canada developed a royal claim of rights. It was notarized by a notary public and claimed a king, sworn in a king, known as Denis I of Canada. The royal claim of rights was sent by registered mail. The receipts have been retained by us to Westminster and to Buckingham Palace, and there has been no response. The constitutional case, freedom of association, and the grand jury judgment was also sent to Westminster and Buckingham Palace. That office replied that the case should be addressed to the de facto Governor General of Canada, sending us back to the accused. So here's just a little snippet of our royal claim of rights and just a couple of paragraphs out of it. The province of Quebec, having refused to sign the Constitution in 1982, that is an offense against the public order and good governance of the nation of Canada, and that action has the effect of immediately dissolving any delegate without limits under the authority of the Sovereign of Canada. The act described above constitutes an offense against public order and good government of Canada and is a contradiction with the law and the customs in force in Canada. And good government requires that the public policy be based on the supreme law of the Constitution of Canada, which renders inoperative anything contrary to that provision. So the society was formed. It's a non-profit society. A claim of royal rights was developed and forwarded to Westminster and Buckingham. Everything has been notarized by a notary public, and a king has been crowned. So there's a clipping from the newspaper article, Denis I, de jure, King of Canada. So why name a king? Simple, because the throne was empty. The charade can't go on any longer. This king is like any other monarchy we've had in the past. There is no comparison. Denis I, de jure, Denis Pemont, is a man of the people. He's a simple and ordinary person. He doesn't want to be king. It was recognized after going through the grand jury case that he went through that there was a lot of problems within our government, and somebody needed to step up and do something. So as a de jure monarch, Denis I has the full intent to step aside once a legitimate de jure government is seated. He doesn't want to be in that position. The king, as stated in the royal claim of rights, is a servant of the people. I would encourage everybody to take a look at the royal claim of rights on our webpage, or it's read out in a video on our YouTube channel. People are not, so he's a servant of the people are not subjects to the king. His only task is to ensure that the people who are elected or appointed to work under him are governing to the Constitution. What the Royal Society has done is provided an opportunity to hand the Constitution and the monarch back to the people of this country where it belongs. This isn't an illegal conquest of power, but an understanding that the government is out of control and the law has been ignored. We need to take Canada back in a legal, legitimate, and constitutional manner, and we'll use our freedom of association to create a de jure government and then let the people decide which form of governments they wish to proceed with. The de facto government should be aware of this initiative as it's been documented and archived with a notary public in Quebec. They've also been sent various notices, and also those same notices and judgments have been sent to Westminster. Just another excerpt from the Royal Claim of Rights. The Royal Public Society of Canada has signed an Act of Union in 2019, and members from each province have agreed to adopt the Constitution Act 1867 as the guiding document for the de jure society. The Constitution, with all the mystery around the validity of it, and with the many amendments over the years, is not perfect, but it's a starting point. It's the supreme law of Canada. According to R. Rogers Smith, who is a constitutional expert, the Constitution has never been ratified, and the most logical step forward would be to form a federal union and ratify the Constitution. And that's just what we've done. In June of 2019, a member of each province got together and we met in Falcon Lake, Manitoba, and we signed on to an act of union to federate Canada. And then we reviewed the Constitution line by line and agreed to adopt it with the provision that we will not accept the amendments. There may be a few amendments that we'll keep, but we reserve the right to revise them. Just a few more paragraphs from the Royal Claim of Rights. It says that good government requires public policy be based on the Constitution, the supreme law, and anything outside of that is contrary. The people of Canada as a whole remain the owner beneficiary of the sovereign of Canada, delegated in trust through the Canada Act. And the Royal Sovereign of Canada, the King of Canada, is a public servant, and all federal, provincial, or territorial delegates appointed by him to ensure public order and good governance are subject to the Constitution. So that's the only powers that this monarch has. So who are we at the Royal Public Society of Canada? We're just everyday citizens, voluntary, working in the name of public order and for good government of Canada. We recognize that our country is in a mess, and we're stepping up and standing up, trying to do something about it. And we're appointed under the authority and jurisdiction of the Sovereign of Canada by Denis I, de jure, King of Canada. We recognize that we are personally liable for our own acts, and that we're protected under extraordinary recourse as a matter of urgency in assistance to persons in danger by the law of the Good Samaritan Act. We don't advocate a rebellion, a revolt, or a revolution, nor an unlawful or criminal opposition. Just one second. The Royal Society has a mandate to redress the wrongs that have occurred for public order and good governance. We love our country, and our amazing team of regulars and part-time volunteers are committed to helping others. We take our convictions and we're turning them into action. What we stand for, I just put a few items here because there's a lot of things, but these are kind of the main items. And, and it's only a beginning. It'll evolve as the society grows. Excuse me. So these elements of our platform are fundamental to secure the health, safety, and prosperity of Canadians in the future. We've adopted the Constitution Act as our guiding document. We agree that the amendments that have been made over the years were not done in a constitutional, lawful, or legal manner. Therefore, we reject most amendments and reserve the right to review all for legitimacy and suitable application to a de jure governments. The Constitution belongs to the people, and they will be provided an opportunity to shape their Constitution in a manner that makes sense to Canadians. In regards to law and justice reform, a return to common law is essential if we're to live in a just society. Common law is common to all mankind, and it's the most unifying and equalizing force that we could ever have. In regards to monetary reform, the current de facto government has allowed our monetary system to be sold out to private bankers through participation in the International Monetary Fund. There's no greater damage done to this country than what has been allowed to occur when our government gave the right to print money to the private banks. The majority of taxes collected go to pay the interest to private banks who never had the money in the first place to lend. In regards to healthcare, again, the de facto government has sold out to large corporations like pharmaceutical companies and medical suppliers, making our health system inefficient and unimaginable. The costs unmanageable. The costs continue to rise and the services continue to be depleted. And in regards to environment, our government has sold out to put large corporations and bought the climate change propaganda, meanwhile ignoring the destruction caused by those same corporations in polluting our skies, our land, and our water. The environmental focus is on a fictitious problem rather than the actual cause of the environmental destruction. And again, this is just a start. And as we develop the society, then this will also grow. I'm just about running out of voice here. I'm just about done. So making progress. Like I said, we met in Falcon Lake, Manitoba in June of this year, and we signed on to an act of union and we adopted the Constitution Act. In the end, there's an opportunity for a brighter future, and it's been laid at our feet. We have a united country now, which should have been done 50 years or more ago, and a constitution that belongs to the people of Canada. We can use this constitution as a guide, or we might disregard it all in its entirety. That's the decision of the people of Canada must make, not the de jure society or any one individual. There is no playbook. I need to remind you again, there is no playbook. We have the rules of the game, that's the Constitution, but how we develop our society is up to us, the people of Canada. The steps to build the government are outlined in the Constitution, and it's in this document that the citizens of Canada will find the protection of freedoms to which they're entitled. So with the Constitution in hand, we take the next steps to creating the country we deserve and to which we're entitled. This is just a little snippet from a book I was reading, and unfortunately I didn't write down the author, so I can't give the author credit, but certainly know that these are not my words. It says, anytime there's reform, it goes through 3 stages. The first one is the darkest, when it's filled with tyranny and increasing oppression, and that's what we're finding. Everybody's feeling it. The second stage is a general public awakening, and that's coming. That's coming. People are waking up. You can tell by the comments on social media that more and more people are aware of what's going on. And then finally, the third stage, and this is where we all have to work together. The shackles of tyranny are broken. So some of the information presented here might seem nonsensical, imaginary, or maybe even untrue. Everyone is encouraged to do their own research to discover the truth. It's not been hidden from us. It's just been laying dormant, waiting for a day of incubation. There's a number of excellent resources that you can use to begin your research. You can refer to Speeches of the Throne. They're online on the government website. The Hansard, which is a recording of everything that occurs in the parliamentary debates or the Senate debates. You can refer to university archives or museum archives. And once we have everybody understanding the depth of deception, we can begin to rebuild our governance the way we desire, a way in which offers us our fundamental freedoms. So how are we going to correct this mess? It has to come about through a revolution of values. Just as a political elite are dreaming and scheming their way to realizing a new world order, we need to counter that with a new world order of our own. We need a revolution of values to make headway. It's simply not enough to throw a coin to the homeless person, but we must seek to understand the politics and policies that allow that homeless person to exist. And what I'm trying to say is that we can't keep putting band-aids on the problem. We have to identify the root of the problem and cure the disease. When material desires, machines, computers, profit motives, the next latest and greatest gadget overpower human desires, we're headed into a society where our wants contribute to the political parasites that lobby our governments and affect the outcomes of those policies that we're detesting. So by buying things, we're supporting the corporations that are lobbying the governments to bend the rules in their favor. History is cluttered with evidence of wreckage forced upon us through the ill-advised guidance from the political leaders determined to foster a society of hate and ignorance, and I might add division. We need to develop a system of democracy that leads with compassion for humanity. So we need to create a new world order on the basis of agreed upon version of the public good. That is, creating shared goals based on self-sacrifice and a little bit of altruism. If you're self-seeking, you can't be working for the public good. We may be able to find solutions by approaching the situation with humility and with a disposition to be open-minded, to hear all sides and respect the opinions of one another. We need to be able to weigh the value and the potential of the various arguments and bring forth those solutions that benefit the public good. If we can create a system based on the public good, it takes away the ability of the self-interest groups to lobby the politicians, or the ability of the politicians to scheme and strategize and develop their own version of public good, or the version that's lobbied onto them by the political parasites or the self-interest groups who support them. Our wants are contributing to the very society that we're detesting. The profit motives of the corporate oligarchs enable them to continue to lobby our elected officials to change society to their benefit and not ours. The largest of the corporations have huge political persuasive powers that influence the policy direction. It influences the regulatory environment and the restrictions of rights that we're seeing today. A revolution of values can help us to distinguish from those who seek to capitalize on profits only to increase the gap between poverty and wealth, and those who in earnest are trying to implement a fair and just society. Conversion will take place through the acts of empathy that are carried out to people who are not your natural allies. And that's been the hardest thing for me to learn over the past just over a year. It means reaching out to people whose political views we find distasteful or even repugnant. Everybody has a voice in a democracy. So my pledge, I refuse to accept that we're so lost in our ways that we can't overcome these challenges we face. I refuse to secede to a power that operates in immorality, injustice, and deceit. I refuse to give up on humanity and all that is good and decent within each one of us. And I will always stand with those who have been discarded by society through no fault of their own. I will bow in humility in an effort to empathize with those who are not my natural allies, because I understand that the division is created by an ideology that's been developed through propaganda and deceit. I recognize that it's much easier to reflect on historical actions and point out what's done wrong, rather than to dream about what a future might look like and how it might be structured. For me, a huge understanding came when I realized that as de jure Lieutenant Governor for Alberta, I'm not only standing up for myself, but for a whole province. And within that province is a mixed society with many different beliefs. So even though I may not agree with all that's presented in front of me, I have to be mature enough to validate all opinions and concerns and weigh the benefits, not based on my values, but rather based on what's best for society as a whole. To do that means those who aren't my natural allies have opinions and values that need to be regarded just as every person does and expects in a democratic society. This will demand my imagination to look beyond my individual needs and see the common good. I have to be willing to subordinate my self-interest and cooperate for the common good of our society as a whole. This is where we're at. Are we ready as a society to admit the same, or are we all seeking to satisfy our own needs despite the hardship that it may cause to others? When I ask this question of myself and I think about it, I don't know if we're ready as a society to move forward in this manner. I do, though, think that we can overcome the division. So finally, I'll leave it with this. If you build it, they will come. I'd like to say, though, that if we build it, we have the foundation started. We need your help to build upon that foundation. In 1967, Martin Luther King said, "Some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony. But we must speak, for we are deeply in need of a new way beyond the darkness that seems so close around us." And that's what we need, folks. We need a revolution of values to help us develop a system that leads with compassion for humanity, power with morality, and strength with a vision. We need people of influence who have faith and courage to accept the challenge and help propel humanity towards the goal of the creation of a new world. Won't you join us? And thanks for your time today. That's all I have. I hope you enjoy this video, and I hope you learn a little bit from it. And I hope you have a good, well, for me anyways, it's a frosty day, a good frosty day. And let us know what kind of feedback you have in the comments. Thank you very much.